Grüß, willkommen in einem Aufregens video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 2 of my Star Trek, the original series and animated series, timeline series of videos. In this video I'll be covering the period from 1 AD to 2000 AD, which covers the timeline up to the invention of warp. To assist viewers to verify if my timeline is correct, I have provided information which can allow viewers to identify the episode the critical information I'm mentioning is contained in, and they can check it themselves. A full description of the information contained on each slide can be found in episode 1 of the video series. This is just a summary which provides all the information in a single slide. When Gene Roddenberry created Star Trek back in 1966, he had a vision which remained basically consistent over the following 3 years. The animated series and early movies retained this consistency in the most part. When The Next Generation was released in 1987, Gene's vision had changed, and the past needed to change in order to be consistent with this new vision. This video series will look at the original vision of Star Trek. In the episode How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, an alien called Kulkakan visits Earth. Kulkakan's who is a sole survivor after his civilization collapsed, visited Earth in the past and influenced the inhabitants of Earth, or educated them. The historical origin of the myth starts in about 250 AD, so Kukulkan visited Earth about 250 AD or slightly earlier. In the episode Amok Time, we learn Spock's family held its land for over 2,000 years, which is earlier than 264 AD. He must have come from an important family, or perhaps this is common due to Vulcan longevity. If this is correct, the birth rate is probably very low. This date is even before Surak was born, which occurred between 300–399 AD, so this must be an old family reaching back into the times of war on Vulcan. Beta Portolan is a system which contained an ancient civilization, which was destroyed by an alien single-celled creature. It was the first of the 3 known civilizations which were destroyed in this manner. Federation archaeologists had conducted some investigation of this civilization. The date it was destroyed is unknown, but was possibly at least 2,000 years ago, perhaps in 264 AD. I only use this date because we would normally only refer to a civilization as ancient if it was Roman or earlier, or that kind of period. The other option is that it occurred in 1964, which was 100 years prior to the next target civilization. I'm assuming the little critters are moving at sublight speed between systems, so it may have taken 100 years to get to the next target. However, I think the word ancient should be considered, and it's got to be a lot older than 1964. And regardless, it's unlikely the little critters would have made it in just 100 years. I don't think they would have got up to relativistic speed, so they probably spent a lot longer than 100 years. In the episode The Jihad, we introduced to the Vedala asteroid, or planet really, and the Vedala race, who is the oldest spacefaring race the Federation is aware of. They must predate the Vulcans. We know the Vulcans, who eventually became the Romulans, left Vulcan at the earliest 300 AD. I'm assuming this race became a spacefaring race in 300 AD, if not earlier. A quick note, I have to assume lost or extinct races do not count. They need to be a race in the Federation of known by the Federation and in contact with the Federation. They also need to possess interstellar space capability, not interplanetary only. I would suspect while this race could be the oldest known spacefaring race in contact with the Federation, their overall power could not be that great. They likely became pacifists and attempted to pacify a few planets around them, including the Score, but were not that powerful compared with the Federation. In the episode How Sharper Than the Serpent's Tooth, Kulkakan leaves Earth after he teaches the inhabitants whatever he was meant to teach them. Kulkakan must have left before the Europeans arrived, so if he arrived in 250 AD, I would suspect he may take 100 years and would have left 100 years later. I have no idea why he left. Perhaps he wanted to guide other races. Surak is the father of Vulcan, obviously a pacifist who lived during the 4th century. While not contained in this episode, Memory Alpha claims Surak lived in the 4th century, which I assume is Earth century. This is sometime between 300 and 399 AD. As the Vulcans lived for a long time, I can assume he was born in 300 AD and lived through the entire century. While this time frame of 1,966 years or less may seem like a long time to us Earthfolk, it only represents about 19 to 20 generations for a Vulcan. A good question to ask is, when did the Romulans leave Vulcan, or the Vulcans which became Romulans? I'd assume it would have occurred during the period of war in order to allow all records to be lost, basically in the time of Surak or just before. If the Romulans had a primitive space drive, which took many years to arrive at Romulus, they could have arrived there in 400 AD. This gives the Romulans about 1600 years to colonize and populate their primary planet and then start expanding into space, meeting the Terran expansion, which resulted obviously in war. While this theory is possibly a stretch, in order to work I have to assume the lifespan of the Romulans was less than that of the Vulcans. Perhaps the long travel in radiation-filled space affected their lifespan. To populate Romulus in 1600 years, this would take a much shorter lifespan, or it would require a much shorter lifespan, unless the Romulan women acted as baby machines, which I doubt. Another theory is that once the Vulcans became all peacy, they may have increased their longevity, and as the Romulans weren't, peace-filled, they didn't get the longevity boost. The Metron which showed itself to Kirk in the episode Arena was born in 764 AD. We are unsure how old the race is, but it must be a lot older. Zeta is an alien non-Federation planet which was destroyed a millennium ago, 1,000 years I expect. This was likely in or around 1266 AD. This is mentioned in the episode The Lights of Zeta. The Enterprise discovers a time trap, a sort of Bermuda Triangle in space, in the episode The Time Trap. Once the spacecraft is captured, it quickly runs out of power and is unable to escape. It's possible the first ship to arrive in the time trap, or at least the first ship which founded what was to become to the Elysian, arrives in the time trap in 1267 AD, or around about 1,000 years earlier, as was stated in the episode. MNR7 started colonising Vendikar in the same system, possibly about 1564 AD. Vendikar became independent and started a war with MNR in 1764. The war raged until 2264. This is described in reasonable detail in the episode A Taste of Armageddon. In the episode The Magics of Megas II, we have a magic-based universe, and in this universe there was only a single intelligent life form called the Megans. The Megans arrived on Earth millennia ago and left about 1691 AD. In the episode The Squire of Gothos, an alien called Trelane visits or views Earth from 900 light-years away, thus sees Earth 900 years ago. He mentions Napoleon in the episode, who was at his peak in 1805. This means it must be currently 2805, which cannot be the case. If this is 2264, which everyone else feels it should roughly be, then Trelane is viewing Earth during the year 1364, which is in the Middle Ages. I suspect an error has been made and the distance is actually 460 light-years away, which will allow Napoleon to be mentioned and viewed, of course. On the other hand, we do have another reference to the 900 light-years away, when Kirk mentions deserts are 900 light-years away. I'm uncertain what to think in this case. My gut feel is to say it's 460 light-years away, and the early desert comment could be about a specific desert plant on the other side of Federation space. In conclusion, I have to assume there is an error, and Trelane is actually 460 light-years away from Earth, which gives us an idea of how large the Federation is in 2264, and actually aligns with several other references or guesses that I've made based on those references in the past. In The Savage Curtain, we learn that Klingon founded father was Carlos the Unforgettable, which set the pattern for Klingons or Klingon tyranny. While not contained in the episode, Memory Alpha claims he first united the Klingons in the 9th century, which I assume is Earth century, which is sometime between 800 and 899 AD. I seriously doubt this is correct. While the Memory Alpha theory is interesting and doesn't really have any references in the episode, the real issue with it is Carlos's uniform, which resembles a modern Klingon uniform. The other issue is the 9th century is more than 1400 years ago. It would be like saying that Justinian's attempt to reunify the Roman Empire set the pattern of all Western civilization, which is A, not the case and simply not reasonable to say. As the Klingons were a stand-in for the Soviets, Carlos is likely closer to a Lenin, Stalin or Mao, who set the pattern of their respective totalitarian civilizations and unified their people and started expanding out. A good analogy would be if Trotsky was leader of the USSR and managed to conquer the world as his particular version of communism wanted to do so. The Klingons needed to have expanded into space about the same time as the Romulans and Terrans to allow them to be equal to those nations. As a result, linking Carlos to Lenin in 1919 or 1920 would work. This gives Carlos 80 years to unify his world, and then his successor would then sally out to create the Klingon Empire, retaining the tyrannical form of government Carlos created. In the episode The City on the Edge of Forever, McCoy was able to change the timeline when he went through the Time Gate, but Kirk and the landing party close by remained unchanged. If McCoy caused a split in the timeline, Kirk and Spock may have ended up in the new timeline, but perhaps being close to the gate, they were protected from any change. As the Enterprise disappeared, this range of no time change must be very small. Regardless, time travel is a complex business and should be avoided at all costs. I know this is not part of the original series, but as it does not affect the timeline that I'm creating, and I really like the T'Pol character, and I cannot resist including it. In 1957, the vessel Tamir was serving on an investigation of the first artificial satellite launched by humans, then a pre-warp civilization. This was Sputnik 1. A mishap with their impulse manifold forces the craft to crash land in Pennsylvania. The captain is killed and Tamir, as second-in-command, takes charge. A distress signal is sent, but after more than 2 weeks no reply is received. From fear of starvation, Mestral and Tamir enter the nearby town of Carbon Creek, Pennsylvania. Over the next few months, the Vulcans successfully integrate themselves with the townsfolk, renting an apartment from Maggie, a tavern owner. Tamir was T'Pol's second foremother, great-grandmother, and T'Ler's former grandmother, or grandmother. While the events in the Enterprise series only superficially resemble that in the next or the original generation, this event could have occurred in both timelines. Mainly because I think any split in the timeline probably occurred in the 1960s, and this occurred before 1960. I would like to believe T'Pol is out there somewhere in the original series timeline. In the episode Miri, civilization on a planet called Earth-2 collapsed 300 years prior. The Enterprise visited it in 2264, which makes it 1963, and the only reason why I'm using that is that this is a copy of Earth. This could be used to date for Kirk's 5-year mission, assuming Earth-2 collapsed the year Star Trek was released in 1966. I have no idea why many canon creators make this assumption, but that's what it is. If this assumption is correct, the year Kirk discovered the planet was 2266. This is 2 years later than the year I am using. Now, there is a reason for this, and I won't go into it too much detail. It'll be covered in later videos, and I've even mentioned it before, but just accept the 2-year difference. I'm not using the 1960 or the 2266 date simply because no one else uses it, preferring the other method to arrive at the start of the 5-year mission, which dates it at 2264. We will never have an exact idea of the date, so all dates could be expected to have an error factor. This is pretty close to Okuda's estimate, and that's what I prefer to use. And I wonder if he used the source, this source to derive it, or some other source. I would like to know how he came up with that estimate. Earth-2 shows us another way humanoids are spread around the galaxy. Pure probability. I doubt this has any reasonable chance of occurring more than once. Occurring once is pretty unlikely, and actually there is an episode where this occurs again, so we're really stretching the bounds of probability to well beyond breaking point. The Andromeda Galaxy is dominated by the Kelvin Empire, which had sent an expedition to the Milky Way. They may have left 300 years prior or in 1965. This is based on the estimated length that they were going to take going back. An interesting coincidence, 1965 is very close to when the series first came out. The alien race is very unlike humans, so probably has nothing to do with the civilization destroyed 500,000 years ago by some type of supernova, which we'll discuss later in another episode. Perhaps the supernova, which blew up 500,000 years ago, has something to do with the rising radiation. I doubt it, but who knows? Andromeda is clearly not a particularly pleasant place. In the episode Turnabout Intruder, we discover another Federation research facility exploring another long-dead civilization. The planet is called Camus 2. When it collapsed is not mentioned, neither the reason why. There is a functioning machine and the ruins don't look that old, so something may have killed the civilization slowly, with the last inhabitants dying only a few hundred years prior. Perhaps this machine was critical in keeping the survivor alive. My wild guess is this civilization may have collapsed 300 years ago, about 1966. This could be totally wrong, and we have many examples of functioning machines from dead civilizations which are older, but it's a timeline that I'm going to be using, or it's a line in the sand that I'm using at this particular point in time. The year the Turian system was colonized is unknown, but it must have been a long time ago. So long, some form of evolution had to occur to allow the women to survive on this planet. How they survived before the humans, Romulans and Klingons arrived is unknown. Perhaps Vulcan or other spacefaring races were the original target. Evolution takes a long time normally, but may have sped up by a few hundred years based on genetic engineering or unusual radiation. After all, there was some sort of unusual radiation on this particular planet. Nonetheless, my guess is 300 years is reasonable, so the Turian system was probably colonized in 1967. In Assignment Earth, the Enterprise goes back to 1968 to do a historical study when it intercepts Gary 7, an alien-trained Earthman who is tasked with preventing World War III. I suspect Gary is the event which caused the split in the timeline from the original series timeline to the Next Generation timeline by preventing World War III. I suspect the aliens which assisted Gary may be the Preservers, which could in turn be an offshoot of the Telosians. If the Enterprise was not there, perhaps Gary would have died in the transmission to Earth, because there were two other agents that mysteriously died earlier, so there could be another force somewhere else trying to protect the original series timeline by killing off these aliens. By intercepting Gary, Gary managed to maybe survive some trap that was set for him. In Tomorrow As Yesterday, the Enterprise goes back to Earth in the year 1969. I originally thought this event may have caused the timeline divergence from our timeline. However, now I believe it was Gary 7 which caused the time split, as he stopped World War III, which looks like the pivotal event which created the original series timeline. The new timeline, perhaps the Next Generation timeline, still has World War III occurring, but it's much later, so even this timeline probably is not our timeline. World War III occurred in the gap between the moon landing and the eugenics war. This is the primary event which causes our timeline to diverge from the Star Trek timeline, specifically the original series Star Trek timeline. World War III probably lasts for 4 years and only involves a limited nuclear exchange. Anything else would end the Star Trek series permanently. It probably only involved the major powers in Europe, as most of the rest of the world needed to be free of major power forces to allow the genetically altered supermen to take them over. The most likely scenario is a Soviet attack in Europe, which uses chemical weapons. In desperation, NATO uses tactical nuclear weapons to halt the advance, and then pushes the Soviets back to their start line. To create a death toll of 37 million, it's likely only cities in Germany and surrounding countries were subject to nuclear attack. World War III weakens the First and Second World, that's the developed West and the communist world, allowing the genetically altered supermen to take over the non-aligned world. It may have caused communism to fall in the USSR and instigated the seeds for a final united Earth to emerge. It's likely in the eugenics war the weakened superpowers joined together. It must be noted, while there was a World War III, the US specifically still had the resources and technology to develop the DY-100 spacecraft and use it for the exploration of the solar system during this 20-year period. As for the 600 million body count in the movie First Contact, we need to look at that. As the First Contact Enterprise most likely arrived during the Eugenics War, not World War III, as we'll discuss later, a body count of 600 million could very well be highly viable. This is another fact which indicates this is when the Enterprise actually arrived, or should have arrived, rather than during a period the united Earth was united, Mars was colonized and probably independent, and Earth already colonized at least one other planet in another system. Sometime between 1990 and 1996, the DY-100 spacecrafts were built. The SS Botany Bay was a DY-100 class spaceship. We know that there is a DY-500 class as well, and possibly classes between these two values. The DY-100 class was built between 1990 and 1996 and was designed for interplanetary travel only. The DY-500 was probably designed for interstellar travel, which is why Kirk first assumed it was a DY-500 when he saw the DY-100 or the Botany Bay. It could have been the first DY class designed for sustainable interstellar travel, that is the DY-500. As the first Earth-Saturn probe occurred about 2009, it's possibly it used a DY-100 class spaceship, but likely a DY-200, DY-300 or a DY-400. The specific DY-100 used by Khan was modified to allow it to conduct interstellar travel. We discover later this was an emergency, and this may have been the first interstellar Earth ship which ever left the Sol system, at least with living people on board. It's also possible this was an older ship purchased by Khan from the US before he was involved in the Eugenics War. Kirk seems to imply this ship class was superseded in 2018, which could be related to its engines. The DY-100 used atomic engines, while in 2018 ships were built which could travel between systems, perhaps due to the invention of impulse drive and impulse engines. Perhaps the DY-500 was the class of ships built in 2018, which first used impulse drive, which could allow it to travel interstellar, that is, between systems or between stars in the galaxy. The last of the genetically altered dictators was Khan Noon Singh, who controlled a quarter of the Earth at its height and takes over India, at least initially. It's logical Singh was centred in India and expanded west into the Middle East and east into Asia proper. It's unlikely to have included China, Russia or Europe, but may have included everything between Egypt and Vietnam. Singh took power in 1992, probably in India, and may well have taken over many of his fellow supermen to the east and west. It's likely they peacefully joined him when they saw the other supermen fall to the major powers. Once the other supermen were removed, the remaining major powers then decided to attack Singh and his new unified, genetically altered empire. In 1993, a group of genetically altered supermen took over 40 countries and began to fight among themselves, according to the episode in The Space Seed. The 40 countries were most likely non-aligned countries which were not involved in World War III. Khan was the exception, as he had already taken over a country the year before. Perhaps his father was the leader of India, and he just took it over from his father when his father passed away. During 1993 to 1994, the major powers retake a number of the countries controlled by the genetically altered supermen, mainly in South America and Africa. The remaining genetically altered supermen likely joined Khan for self-defense. I'm uncertain why the remaining superpowers attacked the genetically altered supermen. Perhaps one of the genetically altered supermen attacked one of the superpowers, and after World War III, the superpowers were in no mood to tolerate any aggression at all. Khan purchases or steals a DY-100 class spacecraft because he knows he'll be the next target. This would have probably occurred before he was involved in any war. Khan was likely attacked in 1995 by the remaining superpowers and defeated in a 2-year campaign. Khan and his followers escaped in a DY-100 sleeper ship. Most likely this was an older DY-100 purchased from the US when it was a peace, specifically to act as an emergency escape vessel in case Khan lost. Khan could have even stolen it, which may have triggered the final war. Assuming the ship could reach half the speed of light, which is a real stretch, and it travelled for 268 years, then it could have travelled no more than 134 light years away. More likely it was half this distance or even less. I will make an attempt to fit the events of the First Contact movie into the early history of the Earth, as the stated year in First Contact and the involvement of the Enterprise crew in the development of warp drive cannot be correct. It breaks too much of the original series canon. The final Contact Enterprise may have appeared at the end of the Eugenics War, or during the war, discovered that the Botany Bay was a key factor in the Vulcans discovering Earth and giving Earth the incentive to expand into space. The movie pretty much would run as it does in reality, or as it did, except it was to help the genetically altered Supermen to launch the first interstellar sleeper ship and the Borg attempt to stop this. The sleeper ship launch was the event which would make the Vulcans, probably Vulcan traders, noticed Earth and started the Earth down the path which most likely ended in either the original series or the Next Generation's timeline. While this is a guess, to make first contact, that's with the Vulcans, possible, the following sequence of events could have occurred. Because the Botany Bay is launched into interstellar space, a Vulcan ship notices it, backtracks to its origin, and makes the first contact with Earth. This could have been later than 1997, but 1997 is the earliest possible date of the Vulcan-Earth first contact. We know that Vulcan traders were common, so the first contact may have been Vulcan traders. In this scenario, the Vulcans are using impulse drive. There is another theory. Perhaps the Vulcans were monitoring Earth as they did earlier when Sputnik was launched, and they responded when they saw the first interstellar ship being launched. So it may not have even been Vulcan traders. It may have been simply another intelligence gathering mission similar to the Carbon Creek intelligence gathering mission. Earth, trying to recover after the Eugenics War, decides to focus on expanding into space and start developing the impulse drive because they discovered there are alien civilizations out there. Earth had experienced two rather traumatic conflicts, and now they discover there are lots of other potential threats out there in space. I feel they would have been rather paranoid and decided to focus heavily on security. They decide to direct their energies at expanding into space rather than fighting among themselves. This makes sense, as all wars have at their root the desire to increase available resources to support increased population. Instead of taking it from other countries, Earth now gets the resources to support its growing population from other planets, as well as creating a buffer zone between it and other alien threats, and also making an effort to discover more about the nature of these threats out there. And it's a good thing they did this, otherwise the Romulans would have ended up conquering most of the galaxy. And so we come to a close, or end of episode 2 of my Star Trek The Original Series timeline, in this case covering everything from 1 AD to 2000 AD. The episode scripts can be found using the URL shown. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.